Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to see you. And as we have the full panel with us, very distinguished panel, and I think we can get it going. Happy Eid to all our Muslim colleagues. We all know how dramatic the situation of access to electricity is in Africa. About 600 million people that have no access to electricity. And that is not because the World Bank Group has not done its job. It's been trying for years. In 2007, a group of colleagues from IFC and from the bank thought that if you wanted to get different results, you had to do things differently as well. Cannot continue doing the same thing with the expectation of getting different results. And so they dared, based on failures of the past, from other experiences that the institution had had in the past, that they're thinking differently to improve access to electricity, and particularly to lighting in Africa. They partnered together, the two institutions, bank, IFC, and they also brought together donors, companies that were working in this field, because lighting solutions were there already in the market, but not accessible. They also partnered with governments, and they dared launching an initiative in Kenya, in Uganda, and experiment with a different way of doing things in order to get different results, and hopefully transformational results. This was in 2007. They put their minds together. They aligned the whole supply chain. They thought about standards. And very importantly, with the presence of IFC there, they thought of using the market forces to bring in a solution to lightening the lives, the homes, but especially the life of so many people. Today, 7.5 million people have benefited from this solution that our colleagues put in place together with these other actors. It wasn't easy. One of the experiments failed. But one of them was indeed transformational. It was transformational for the bank group, but it was also transformational, as I said, for the life of these people in Africa, to whom we owe our jobs and to whom we are supposed to be committed in our mission. They did their job. So you can be transformational. A number of lessons with this experience. You can be transformational by just putting your mind to think differently. It's not about, we discovered there that it's not about size. It's not about money. It's not about the magnitude of the investment. It can be, but it's not necessarily about that. And as many of you know, the 2013 strategy of the bank group includes the aspiration, the expectations that the World Bank Group is going to include and work on transformational engagement, as they are called there. And so, in IEG, we thought that we could contribute to examining and understanding how this works by studying the different experiences that we have had during the bank history over the last 20 years in being transformational, because this experience for sure is not unique. The bank group has been transformational in other fields. And this is what is about this conversation that we're having today and the report that you have in your hands. It is this type of reports, new type of reports, line of products that IEG has been working on emphasizing the learning side of our work. You know, we have accountability and learning. So we commission ourselves to looking into a number of engagements, transformational engagements, and we have come up with a number of lessons of what make an engagement, an operation, a program, a policy of the bank group transformational. What does it make? What is it required for an engagement of this type to be transformational? That's what is this session about. We're going to hear from the lead colleague of this report, from Stefan Wegner, the lessons that we have come up with. But more importantly, we're going to hear from a panel of very distinguished colleagues that none of them required an introduction. Going to be chaired by our Senior Vice President Mahmoud, and he will refer to the task of the panel and the conversation that we're going to have within them, and after that, the exchange that we're going to have with you, listening to your questions and to your observations. With this, let me turn it over to Stefan for his summary.
Do you want to demonstrate that?
By the way, this is the small solution, but big in the lives of so many African families that our colleagues put in place. You can take this water here?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Marvin, for your kind introduction and for really situating today's presentation in the importance of meeting the twin goals and also the sustainable development goals. I'm very glad to be here with you today and share our findings. As you know, President Kim has identified transformational engagements as one of four key issues in the new 2013 World Bank Group strategy, with the objective to accelerate progress towards development objectives. But what this is really about, this is about development. This is what we all as development professionals are interested in, should be interested in. How can we have more impact? How can we accelerate progress? How can we actually make sure that by 2030 we will be able to meet the goals that the development community has set itself? So this presentation will essentially, as Marvin said, talk about the approach we've taken. We'll walk you through some interventions that we've reviewed, and then we'll discuss some lessons learned from our analysis. So what did we find? Well, we actually found that the bank has supported transformational engagements in the past, successful transformations in the past, and that these are far and few in the bank's portfolio. They're difficult to accomplish, and they require long-term engagement by the bank in partnership with other donors. And I will get back to these issues as we discuss the lessons. So first of all, the remainder, let me share with you a few of the headlines that we found in the types of engagements that we did review. And these have all been implemented, of course, by the bank group's clients, but with support and catalytic advice and lending support from the World Bank. So 6 million Kenyans gained access to electric power for the very first time that were not connected to the grid. This is in addition to the 7 million or so people that have gained off-grid access that Marvin was referring to earlier through the Lighting Africa project. 750,000 Bangladeshi girls for the first time access secondary education. More than 1.3 million poor Argentinians that weren't covered by the comprehensive health insurance gained access to health services. And more than 14 million more Brazilians were able to obtain social assistance through Bolsa Familia. And finally, Vietnam's GDP grew on an average of 5.5% over a period of 25 years, a powerful mechanism to lift 40 million people out of poverty, which is a huge number. So these are some of the headlines that I wanted to share with you. We'll come back to some of those projects in the presentation, but they're also discussed in broader detail in the report, which will be at the entrance. So the remainder of this presentation, we will discuss how have we defined transformational engagements. Then we'll move into the methodology, how have we assessed them, and then spend a bit of time on lessons learned. So to start with the definition. Now, when we started this work, as evaluators, we were a little skeptical of the value of the term transformational engagements because it had been used in a very loose fashion. It was called a game changer. Other people referred to it as in the context of doing more complex, high-risk, large-scale infrastructure projects such as INGA 3. So it was used in different contexts by different people. And so when we started, we put our minds together, interviewed a lot of people, and we identified 4 key criteria dimension of transformation. One is on relevance. Does it address a major development issue such as poverty, equity, or access to basic social services? The second one, does it support a deep systemic change, or does it create a market? Third, does it have large-scale impact? And this refers not to a bias towards larger scale projects, but how large is the impact relative to the development issue that it tries to address? And finally, fourth, is it sustainable? Are the effects irreversible even when the intervention ends? So just to walk you through an example that I think many of you will be familiar, this is Brazil's Bolsa Familia, which is really a cash transfer program to poor families in exchange for them to sending their children to have to get vaccinations and to attend school. So the major constraint or the development issue here was the gap in access to education and health services by the poor in Brazil relative to the national average. It really created a new system. It unified all of the social assistance programs in Brazil under one platform. And we've seen the number before. It reached 14 million more people than were reached initially by the program before the World Bank became involved. And more than that, we've also seen some interesting outcomes in terms of education attendance in schools being way above expectations and about 68% of eligible children that have received vaccinations. And the program, in more general terms, has been credited with reducing inequality and poverty in Brazil over the last 15 years. So now that you've seen how we've tried to identify and how we've tried to define the concept in more clearly operational and relevant terms for World Bank Group operations, how did we actually assess it? How did we find the projects? Well, we identified a purposive sample of 20 projects and programs that met the 4 criteria that I described earlier, right? Relevance, depth of change, scale of change, and sustainability. That we basically derived from crowdsourcing and lists that had been prepared as part of the Bank Group Strategy 2013. And so we winnowed all those proposals down. We interviewed a lot of people to ask for proposals about which projects they really felt had made a difference, had moved the needle in development terms. And so we came up a list with these 20 that clearly met or exceeded our criteria, and paired them with non-transformational engagements that were very similar in scope and design and objectives. So they had similar objectives. They tried to also transform a sector, a country, or a company, but they fell short of the transformational objectives. They're not failures. They may have met their development objectives and may have even been rated very highly, but they didn't meet this higher bar of transformational change. So we compared and contrasted those pairs and tried to try to identify what is the differences and what are the similarities and what sets those projects apart that were clearly transformational. And what we found is that transformations actually occur in many forms in different sectors. They can be small or large. In fact, the project Marvin was referring to did not involve funding investment at all. It was a technical assistance project that was implemented by IFC and the bank jointly. So you have large infrastructure, long-term sector reform, but you also have very small projects that can be transformational. And we also found those projects, those successful transformations, in low-income countries as well as middle-income countries. So they were widely represented in our sample. So to talk about one example quite briefly, this is a long-term power sector reform in Kenya, which started about 15 years ago. It's still ongoing, and which focused on the major binding constraint in that country, which was that the utility company was bankrupt and it couldn't deliver power. It couldn't increase access to the country. And so the bank helped the country actually turn the utility company around. And with a lot of capacity building and AAA advisory services, it helped actually transform the whole sector to the point that the utility company, which was the problem in the whole system, is now listed as the stock exchange. And access to electricity is now double what it was 15 years ago. It's still a low 23%, but that's progress. But more importantly, the sector has been transformed to be now financially sustainable from a deficit and ailing sector 15 years ago. Another example is the secondary female stipend program in Bangladesh, which has also been transformational in terms of some societal views about the role of girls and women in Bangladesh, where the main problem was girls dropping out of secondary education at an early age, 14 or so, to get married, to have children, don't have a chance to enter the labor force, and also not obtain a higher degree that would allow them to lead more empowered lives. So what this program did is it basically gave cash payments to girls to incentivize them to remain in school longer. And we saw the number at about 750,000 girls that continued in school compared to prior to the program. And so this has actually been linked to some societal change in terms of more women entering the labor force, in terms of more girls getting a degree. And also we've seen in Bangladesh over the last years a decline in the fertility rate, which is not directly attributable to this program, but this is one of the contributors. Finally, and then I'll end with the examples. We also conducted an analysis at the country level where we looked at 6 indicators across 85 countries where this data was available, to let the data lead us to countries which had a superior performance in terms of poverty reduction and sustained economic growth over the period 1990 to 2015. And lo and behold, we identified some of those countries, including in 4 strategic areas that the Bank Group had identified over the last 20 years: the transition economies, PRSPs, poverty reduction strategies, fragility and conflict, as well as long-term engagements in middle-income countries. So within those buckets or priority areas, you can see the green basically denotes the transformed or transforming countries, and the blue is the comparator countries that are lagging behind, that again have very similar preconditions, but didn't reform and didn't transform as quickly as the other countries. So just to pick an example, if you compare Poland with the 2 comparators, the Bank Group there, of course, played a supporting role. It was the government of Poland, it was the government of Vietnam, it was the governments of China that wanted to transform, right? The World Bank provided assistance. So in the case of Poland, it had been very active in the aftermath of the shock therapy privatization, which had led to a huge increase in poverty and unemployment and so, problems in the social welfare systems. So it did a lot of analytical work and lending in terms of poverty, social protection, but also work on sectoral issues such as reform of mining and pension system reform and so on, reform of state-owned enterprises. And similarly in Vietnam, the bank played a catalytic role in the very early days of reform in terms of price reform, advising the government on price reform, and also a series of analytical products and strategic policy loans that supported the reform process there. So now that you've seen some of the examples and I've walked you through how we've actually identified and done the analysis, what did we learn out of all of this? Well, there are lessons at two levels. The first one being certain mechanisms that run across all the transformational engagements. And these may be present in one project singularly, or you may have all elements of all four of those mechanisms in the same project. So the first one being identifying and tackling binding constraints to a development issue. Now, what that means, you see here the photo of the Mongolian herder girls. This was taken from the bank's rural renewable access program in Mongolia, where the problem was simply that nomadic herders didn't have access to power, but they also didn't have access to education services and so on. So the bank tackled this issue head on. It's a very similar program to the one Marvin has described on rural off-grid electrification in Kenya. But they also adopted a cross-sectoral approach by having a rural education project, an ICT project, and a rural livelihoods program that was combined with this. So a lot of these programs and projects include innovations and solutions. I think the Lighting Africa program is a poster child, but also the use of innovative bank instruments like conditional cash transfers, results-based financing, and so on, that we've seen over and over in these projects. And another potent driver of transformational engagement is certainly motivating behavior change, which was also the subject of the recent World Development Report. And so this is really, how do we motivate mothers to bring their kids to immunizations? How do we motivate families to send them to schools? How do we motivate private sector companies to demonstrate and adopt solutions for low-income households? Now, in addition to these mechanisms that are broader, we also found certain factors that distinguish transformational from non-transformational engagements. And these are useful to keep in mind for policymakers and for World Bank staff as we design projects. This doesn't mean that if you fulfill all of these criteria that you will have a transformational outcome, but it does mean that these are things that might be useful in project design and implementation to keep in mind. Very important. So we have factors that refer to the external environment, enabling environment. The alignment of client interests and client ownership in the transformational objectives is paramount. So you see here the hurricane that is devastating the Caribbean every year, which led the Caribbean countries to actually pool those risks and create in the Caribbean catastrophic risk insurance facility. So this was clearly motivated by an urgency to act and by a very keen interest in all the players to move forward. But equally important are internal factors, and those are factors that the World Bank Group can do something about. They relate to design and implementation of projects. And so here, good diagnostic work and analysis of, for instance, the binding constraint of local conditions and capabilities is key. So if you look at the Kenya long-term power sector reform, this was underpinned by a series of analytical and advisory work to pinpoint what are the issues in the system that were really holding back progress. For instance, the bankruptcy of the power company. This project engaged all the stakeholders, including the government, and it adapted its its support to the local context and capabilities, delivering a lot of capacity building as part of its program. And it was a continuing, sustained program over 15 years. So it certainly helped build those local capabilities and transform the institutions which are at the core of governmental transformation. It balanced strategic vision of what needed to be done with more focused interventions that were broken down in more bit-sized pieces. And one of the key things that often in transformations, it hinges on highly qualified technical staff. So some of the programs and projects that we looked at were clearly due to having the right people at the right time in the right place. Think of the transformation of China, for instance, that was where initially the bank appointed a very high caliber team. But we also find that the incentives across the World Bank Group are often not well aligned with really addressing the most binding constraint, and also with doing these kinds of sustained long-term engagements, right? If we're talking about fragility and conflict, we're talking about 25, 30-year time horizons to build and transform institutions. So, and this might be a topic for the discussion, for the panel discussion to pick up later on. Also, these operations have often been considered higher risk than run-of-the-mill operations. Now, there's some evidence to that because innovative programs often do entail higher risk. However, what we found is that because you can scale up pilots more slowly and you can learn in real time through monitoring evaluation systems as you're implementing them, there is a way to mitigate that risk by scaling up step by step. So these are some of the factors that came out of our review. And in closing, let me just say that we've concluded that transformational engagements are certainly possible, and they have the potential to speed up progress towards development objectives. But they require also changing the way in which the World Bank works. So they call on us to focus more on binding constraints. They call on the World Bank Group to be more selective in its assistance programs. And they require the bank to increase its ability to engage in long-term and sustained engagements. And with this, let me close and let me hand it over. Thank you for your attention, and let me hand it over to Mahmoud, who is kindly monitoring the distinguished panel. Thank you very much.
Disconnected.
If not, we can use this.
That one for you.
Right. Well, this is transformational. Thank you so much. Well, we are like 20 minutes late based on this clock there, and on my old pocket watch adjusted in my village time in Egypt, we are just on time. But in all cases, we have to finish by 4 p.m. And I have a challenge. I have a very distinguished panelist, and we have you that you may have after this very good presentation by Marvin and Stefan. You may have many questions or comments. And in this new world, we have many people connected through Polev, and they are going to be sharing questions and comments with us. As mentioned by Marvin, fortunately, the panelists don't need any introduction, and but I like just to provide quick reflections on the excellent presentation and the article and flipping through the very good report after thanking the authors. The relevance of this discussion to the 2030 agenda is great. And when you talk about transformational aspects of development, you just need to go through our twin goals or the sustainable development goals, and you will be seeing what kind of effort are required. from now. Yes, it works now. Thank you. Until 2030, which is not very far. 2030 is just 3 5-year plans or 5 fiscal programs. And if you were going to be believing in these interesting proposals coming from the bank, some of you ought to because you work here, and others who are following, they need really to believe in that or ask questions to convince them. You can really see what kind of work we can do in partnerships in different areas, from policy to infrastructure to issues to human development, dealing in cases of fragility and post-conflict or in conflict. Sometimes could be very much difficult to see how a positive thing can make the transformation. So the easiest thing is to consider the contrast. What if a bad policy is in place? And what if a bad idea is in place? And to what extent these bad ideas could be transformational in the wrong way? And with a reference to a very interesting report led by Mike Spence like 10 years ago, he has a list of dozen bad ideas that were very much relevant to the policymakers. They had depth of change in the country. They have scale of change because they were very much widespread, and they were sustainable because some of them, even when they were introduced like price controls or rent controls, they were introduced like temporary measures, but they ended up following exactly the old Greek proverb that there is nothing more permanent than the temporary. And some of them are still in existence until this moment. So when I had the good luck of seeing a good advisor in a very advanced economy, and I asked him what is his job in the cabinet of ministers, he said, well, I got this assignment of being the filter of oversupply of bad ideas. Of course, this is the thing about the subjectivity, because I bet some of you, I hope not, and many of those who are listening, they may really see many of these measures that were outlined by Mike Spence and his colleagues as bad ideas that could be fantastic ideas, including energy subsidy or including considering the environmental impact of growth after many years of growing. All of these kind of things still have many believers around, and they have plans and they have advocates and they have people who are monitoring the indicators related to them. So I think the start, and that could be the main thing coming from the policy side, when you deal with the binding constraints, it's always when you go and talk to a policymaker from a developing country, who tell you, well, give me finance and give me time, and I'll see you the wonders of the world. And actually, you have seen many countries with ample resources, good finance, and their regimes and authorities have been given decades to rule, and they ended up in what we see in many countries in Africa and the Middle East. So what kind of constraint we're talking about here, and the kind of challenging political economic question that we need to answer, is a very relevant one. The other thing what I liked about this report is not just the good definition of the good engagements. I just impose my bad engagements from that report by Mike Spence and his colleagues, is basically the 11 operational factors. And what I like about them is basically they confirm what we understood after 15 years of trying to help in achieving the Millennium Development Goals. That it's not just resources, you need good institutions and good policies. And you had something which was not very much highlighted as the good institutions and the good policies, which are reflected in this report, but the pro-inclusive growth kind of approaches that have been adopted in the countries that managed to do well in achieving the MDGs. So I think the relevance of this report is high for the policymakers. I hope that you will be having many opportunities to engage with different policymakers. You have good occasions during the General Assembly meetings next week, during the annual meetings, and it could be useful as well to translate it in different languages in addition to the usual. So we have important questions here. First, and the one that had been always mentioned to us during board discussions is basically about selectivity. And as you can see from the report, there are many good ideas, there are many good policies, and we are constrained by different things. So when it comes to selectivity, that could be a question to the whole panel. Your Freedom, who is the executive director representing Switzerland, and a group of countries in different stages of transformation. Alan Gelb, whom I know for many, many years through his good work, that was very much influential in my own research back in the 1980s on financial policy and growth. And Nena, who's leading our work on the partnerships with the private sector in the IFC, and Klaus Stilms, the director, trade and competitiveness, whom I had the pleasure of working with him in different capacities during the last 6 years. So on the issue of selectivity, this always comes when we discuss matters related to budget allocations, priorities. You have been leading our budget work along with other matters, Jorg and the board. And you see this issue of relevance of selectivity that normally ends up with less of adoption of the selectivity than the start of the process.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Yes, indeed. I mean, thinking about this issue from the board perspective, there are three questions that clearly dominate, in my view, how the board is influencing the agenda. On one side, indeed, the selectivity. The two others are risk and size. On selectivity, the board has problem with it just because it is, it is an assembly of expectations from different sides. And different sides. And I must say, the instrument that has helped us substantially, that has emerged from the reform over the last 2-3 years in the country systemic diagnostic. I mean, we have, for the first time, I think, we have now an instrument that at least very independently, so not influenced by government preferences, give us a sense of what could be transformational, what are the major constraints at the country level, and what should be addressed. Of course, then you have to move from there to the country framework, and there the negotiation with government and the issue of comparative advantage of the bank become critical. But nevertheless, we have now at least, in principle, an instrument that allows us to identify where we should invest most of the resources. The resistance on the government side is substantial, and in my case, especially in the case of IDA, there is a shopping list coming from different ministries that's extremely difficult to resist, and that's, I think, I would say, is the dilemma. And as somebody who represents IDA countries, I know how difficult it is from the government side to get the same kind of decision and to focus IDA resources, if possible, combined with IFC resources in areas that can make a difference. I mean, the incentive are not for focusing. The incentive are for dispersing as much as possible the resources available. So, and clearly at the board level, it's very difficult to double check this distribution. But certainly we have seen the need to move in that direction. I don't want to speak too much, but what on the board side, what then is our own resistance to that are issues of risks and issue of size. There is an implicit risk aversion, especially, and there is an impatience. So the risk is not to get the result quickly enough, right? Also because the whole decision-making process is clearly distorted toward the short term. I mean, the board and the decision maker don't see the medium long-term effect. We approve projects, we don't know how they are implemented. So there is a measure that I would suggest from the board perspective to support this kind of initiative is to have more focus and systematic report at the board level on implementation of projects that are similar. So you shift the attention from the time 0 to a time 0 plus 5 or 0 plus 4, and you have an incentive also for staff and management to have that horizon instead of the short term. So from the board perspective, it seems to me we have that one. I have issue on risk and size, but I don't want to mobilize.
Right. Okay, we may come back to that as well. And for the rest of the panelists, Alan, Nena, and Klaus, you are more than welcome to come back to this issue of selectivity. But I have some specific questions as you, starting with Alan, on the matters related to dealing with the challenges of binding constraints and what kind of political economy considerations, especially for the World Bank staff and advisors, they may need to consider in the engagements with the authorities, or in the case of the private sector with MIG and IFC, how to deal with these constraints. Can you identify the main, the presentation did well in giving us hints on the binding constraints, but in your experience, can you get us some sort of a list of your experience of what really faced you and you observed during the years as the main binding constraints and how to deal with them?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Mahmoud. And let me say, I think this is a very useful report. At the beginning, and I was involved as an advisor, I was sort of doubtful about how one would methodologically proceed with a report of this kind. It's a very difficult topic to address methodologically, mainly because one always looks ex post at what has happened rather than as an ex ante exercise. But I think the way in which it's been done, matching transformational projects with actually very good projects, and then trying to become clear on what exactly the difference is and why, is a very useful way of proceeding, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. On the binding constraints issue, this is a very conceptually attractive approach, and as you know, it runs through a lot of the analytical frameworks that have been developed. But it's very complex, I think, once you get into operational details, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The one is that when you do have a very binding, clear constraint, it could be a trade policy, it could be electricity pricing, let us say, very often that is there because of very powerful political forces behind it. And the question then is how to proceed when you are not sure whether you will be successful in changing that. So, I mean, the report is very interesting, for example, of a binding constraint of that kind, looking at the Kenya-Pakistan contrast. I don't think that power projects in Pakistan have not succeeded in putting it onto a self-financing basis because they haven't tried. I mean, this has been a part of the dialogue for a long time, but it hasn't actually worked. Whereas in Kenya, it did work. So that's the one question is, how do you work patiently to try and deal with that kind of binding constraint? The other is that sometimes what was presented as a binding constraint, particularly when you get away from the macro level, is a whole series of little constraints where as soon as one is relaxed, the next one comes. So you have to find a way of anticipating what they will be. So this is not an easy concept, I think, to apply ex ante, except in some very, very clear and possibly unusual cases. So what does this mean for the bank when it's thinking about an operation? I think one message from the report is that when we have analytical work or we have operations, we need to take the operation or the piece of work, think about its objectives, but then think beyond that as to what, if you like, the next stage of those objectives would be, and what are the barriers towards getting to that ultimate goal, and then working backwards as to where are we likely to find impediments. So we have to have that level of ambition that is sufficient for us to think about what the constraints will be beyond perhaps the initial level of what we're doing. And the end point, therefore, of a particular activity is quite likely going to be well beyond the actual developed objectives of the activity itself. And that provides one way of trying to think and anticipate what these constraints are and how would one develop it. As I say, I don't think it's easy. I think, by the way, that the Sustainable Development Goals are actually terribly useful here. Again, I was a bit dismayed when I saw the number and the complexity, but then I began thinking, well, these actually do provide a set of really quite specific and very helpful guidelines on what might one be aiming for in a particular context. So it's not a bad place to start. I think that this process will be very helpful if a report like this if there could be some thought into how to operationalize this report into the process of project planning. One suggestion I would have is that if you look at the mechanisms for the scale up, for the question of dealing with incentives, for the question of leverage, There are a set of questions that one might want to apply to individual operations at the planning stage in a semi-structured way, which could be quite helpful in trying to identify the activities that have the potential for being scaled up in this way. So I would like to see some thought given to how to move from this into an operational tool. Let me stop there because of time. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Nena, related to the work of the IFC, there is a very relevant argument here. It's about the issue related to transactions. And the IFC is good in making transactions, but at the same time, the report is reminding us, in order to have a kind of a lasting impact and to have successful transformation for the policies and for the projects, we need to abandon the one-off approach in dealing with countries or dealing with sectors as well. And in your engagements with the board and with the evaluation and with the clients, you may have seen this kind of argument coming repeatedly about the developmental impact of IFC, with the underlying assumption that when they mention developmental impact, they mean very much transformational, lasting impact. So how can you balance the approach of having successful transactions, because you need to deal with the private sector, deal with the market orientation, at the same time not to ignore these kind of elements of success, especially in the complicated environments that may get you into higher risk than average of projects?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, especially if we have only a couple of minutes. But I really wanted to start by thanking the team for showcasing actually the advisory project as a project that created that transformation. This means that we don't necessarily need large projects, a lot of millions and billions to create that transformation. So to me, that's already kind of a different way of thinking. I also wanted to say that I agree with all of your key overarching themes and conclusions. And as you probably know, with the new CEO now, IFC is at a really particular point of development, and I actually want to quote him because he was invited to join that panel, and now here I am sitting here on his behalf. It ties to selectivity as well, and Jorg already explained the tensions with the governments and how to get the governments actually to also be selective. And I have a bit of a bank experience as well, as you know. I wanted to say that IFC actually has a much greater ability to be selective, because there is a range of clients through whom you can actually deliver what you want once conditions are right to bring them into certain sectors in certain countries. However, as Philippe keeps saying, I mean, IFC 1.0 was, the question is actually, what do you select them for? What do you want them to actually do? And for years, we have been selecting them simply because there was a trend to move some of the Western companies into less developed markets, which by itself was probably also creating impact and was in some ways transformational. They were demonstrating that private sector can be successful in those markets. Others were following. They were employing people. They were improving the standards, environmental and social, governance, etc. So I don't want to say that that was not transformational, but that was IFC 1.0. IFC 2.0 was in the 2000 when we started decentralizing and trying to do more of the same, but with local companies. We put more people on the ground. We were developing relationships with clients who are local, but could do exactly the same that we were doing previously with the foreigners. And now with Philippe, we are in the 3.0 stage, which he calls creating the markets and selecting clients to do exactly what you want them to do, where the binding constraints are present, that they need to be removed, and then originating transactions and structuring them in a way that will make that long-lasting impact. And of course, IFC cannot do it alone. I mean, I just wanted to also, Klaus may want to follow on that. We absolutely need a different way of collaborating with the bank. We need basically some way of contracting with the bank to help us unlock some of those conditions. We have to be selective. We cannot do it in 100 countries in I don't know how many sectors. So we are now in the process of selecting top 2 or 3 priorities in each country where we will exactly want the bank to help us to remove some of those binding constraints. And then we will step in by bringing the clients from our long list of relationships who can actually make a difference on the ground in that sector. And only then, Mahmoud, I think we can mobilize, we can leverage, we can get to trillions, because people will want to come only if the conditions are right and the structures are right. And we can talk about de-risking and building capacity around that. None of this is going to happen just like that. I mean, we have to innovate around instruments and to continue to deploy a lot of advisory services and building capacity, both with the governments and the private sector.
Right, very good. Thank you so much. So Klaus will go back a long way, and I'll give you the simplest question. And I'm very transparent and open about it here, just to resolve any possible conflict here of interest. So the first one is, when we deal with this issue of high-risk environment, the interesting group of fragile and post-conflict states, do you see that our staff in the World Bank Group at large are adequately incentivized to do the job?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No.
Yeah. So what do you about it?
I guess sort of the larger question in terms of is really sort of what are the incentives to engage around transformational projects. And maybe I can start with a little bit in terms of what got me to the bank in 1987, because I had this dream as a summer intern to work for the most innovative person in the bank. And I found that manager, and he agreed to take me on. And so I arrived here in 1987. He said, "It's fantastic, Klaus, to see you. We're going to have a great summer together. The only problem is that I just lost my job because the bank has reorganized." And so that tells you already sort of one very important part. In order to be transformational, you need to have a certain amount of organizational stability, because these are long-term engagements. I think my second observation is, and I've worked with many intrapreneurs in the bank. I think that is what brought many of us here. And I think some of them have done phenomenal things. And they have sort of one thing certainly in common, which is they have gone against the grain, many of them. They have taken risks. They have had ways of doing that were anti-bureaucratic. They have wagered a lot, including their entire career, to take on sometimes the entire system. I remember Alain Lancusol, the person who can claim to have introduced the first water concession. I can think of Michael Klein, who worked on doing business. I can think of Ismail Sergeldin, who worked with Magdi Iskander on SIGAT. I can think of many really people that have put things in place that are still existing. So I think I'm a firm believer that we need to have a subculture of people that are going against the grain. I think a second part that I took away from this study, which I think is really one that we have not successfully tackled, is it is really good to see many of these experiences and examples. I think where we have fallen short, and that is not a question of risk, that is really more a question of sensitivities, is to translate what seems to have worked in one country in one context to another. And I think that is something that the Brazil-Turkey example is a really interesting one, because we actually took somebody who has worked on the Bolsa Familia project and put that person into the Turkey situation, and somehow it didn't totally work. So my question really is, how do we become smarter in terms of adapting to local contexts? And I think on that one, we have to be really, really careful that we don't become sort of a cookie cutter operation, because that is, I think, sort of coming up with simple recipes is a real danger. And that sort of goes back to your first question, is, are we ready on FCVs? I understand the political imperatives. I understand the willingness. I understand all of that. I remember the first time we talked about LICAS countries 15 years ago. I see clearly a recognition of many levels of why we have to do more. But I have to say, that's my own personal impression as a staff member, is that I don't think that we have quite figured out how to actually take resources, link them to people and to programs and interventions that are going to make quite that same difference. I think there's too much on the supply side, and when it comes down to how do we deploy people differently, what do we know in terms of what has really worked, either it's the conditions that are so vastly different. When you go from Burundi to Somalia to South Sudan, you have basically a spectrum of what you could be doing. And I don't think that we have quite figured out how to actually bring different skills together in a way that we can actually operate. I think there's a risk in our own mental model that we start thinking that FCVs are a little bit like low-income IDA countries, and we need probably a very different mental approach and also operational approach. And I think the more riskier these situations are, the more we need to actually bring partners in that are thinking very differently and have different experience.
Thank you so much. So we have 25 minutes, and the panelists are still here. And we have, of course, the authors, and I hope that you're all ready to engage in answering or reacting to your questions and comments. But before turning the floor to you and getting your questions as well online, I see from the operational factors that you identified aspects related to rigorous diagnosis, raising awareness, correctly assessing and managing risks, which is an issue that Jörg may like to come back to. And the fourth one is basically about robust monitoring and reporting system. What's common between those four aspects is a kind of a generous assumption about good quality data and information that you may have. I didn't see that in the presentation, but I think it could be hidden there, that you are assuming that at least at the project level, you are getting what you want of adequate information and the feedback for the correction that is required along your assessment. But I'll be quite happy to listen to your reaction to this issue on the constraints related to data and information from the report side, and definitely from the panel. Now, any question, any comments, any suggestion from the team here? And until we get that, I may ask Marvin or Stefan or Andrew to respond to this issue about data quality and
Just very briefly, Mahmoud, you're absolutely right. I think the importance here is that we do need to keep learning in real time from these engagements that are not the run-of-the-mill projects. So they may have unintended effects, and also they may be scaling up pilots, where it's very important to know what works, what doesn't work. So some of the constraints that we found as we were looking at the current monitoring system, and this is both on the operational side and also on the IEG side, is that a lot of those interventions are actually programmatic in nature. They're long-term in nature. So we're not currently capturing programmatic approaches, I think, adequately across the bank group, as well as an IEG. And also the other salient feature is that in many respects, the transformational impact will be generated over a long period of time. But our project may close after 7 years, after 4 years. So once the lending operation is concluded, we don't actually get to the transformational issues. So these are just two items on that agenda.
From your IFC experience?
On the data?
Yeah.
No, I don't want to me, that's the toughest kind of nut to crack, to have the right metrics that we can actually follow and demonstrate what are we actually doing on the ground. But that's a really very complex question to us.
Right. From Paul, we got this question, and it's reacting to the presentation about behavioral change. So this specifically the question is, what does the bank, I mean the World Bank Group, including IFC here and MIGA, concretely do to motivate behavioral change? Yeah, so you and Klaus on that one.
This is what I wanted to say about in terms of IFC, because you also asked about the transactional behavior. Yeah. We actually even recruit people with certain level of skills that actually makes us even more transactional, because you recruit MBAs with good structuring skills. And I think we are going to move into this creating markets world that Philippe wants us to focus on. I'm the first one to recognize that we need to change the skills. But even with the skills that we have, we can do better, and we have done better in terms of monitoring the long-term performance of staff, so that even the transactions and the activities follow people even if they move. So we had something that's called long-term performance awards that we are trying to reinstitute, and we also have specific performance awards for the areas that we want to incentivize. Last year we started with performance awards for the best intervention in FCS, also the best collaboration with the World Bank, and people from all parts of the World Bank group qualify for those awards. And I have to say that that's already changing the way how people look at some of the transformational collaborative efforts.
Yeah. You had something to say on risk and risk management at the beginning?
No, I was thinking at this changing mentality and risk at the same time. For me, one of the best examples that show how difficult it is to engage is the issue of forced labor in Uzbekistan, and how the engagement and the persistent engagement of the bank in the cotton sector with the aim of progressively eliminating first child labor and second forced labor implies taking the risk of working close to forced labor for a few years before you get to the result you want. And here, again, you cannot address an issue like this. This is ingrained on one side in the cotton policy that came from 30, 40 years ago and is evolving very, and on the other side, on the mentality of an authoritarian state, you cannot address if you don't accept that the evolution is slow, and therefore the approach that you get from CSO and the cotton campaign, that the bank should not address that issue because it cannot get the result in 2 years. And here's where the board react and say, well, if that's the case, we don't, right? So I mean, these tensions are real once you address questions that are of high social sensitivity. But this is where the transformation takes place, in my view. And frankly, I have my own positive assessment of what the public, the engagement in irrigation and agriculture by the World Bank and the Indorama investment, the cotton transformation firm, big firm by IFC, I have, what they are doing. But I know that we are resisting pressure of those who would like to change the world, by magic and don't want to accept the price of this. So, I mean, transformation means time, patience, and risk, including the risk to be treated, as going against human rights and all the rest, because it takes the time it takes. So, I mean, and that's a difficult battle because tendentially, when it comes to difficult issues, our home constituency are risk averse.
I have a question. I'm very pleased that you mentioned several times the governance and the effectiveness of institutions at the local level. Sometimes I read it at national, sometimes it's domestic, sometimes it's local. And again, from the experience of the MDGs, we saw the success coming from effective work at the municipalities. These are basic. In some middle-sized countries, you can see some of the districts and small towns are the size of a decent country, which are going to be participating next week in the UN. So the issue of governance and institutional aspects related to the engagement with the local authorities. Is the bank doing more in that? I know that our engagement are mainly with central government, federal governments. Some of them are generous enough to allow us to go into the subnational level. Some of them, for complicated political economy issues, they don't allow us to do that. And this could be one of the concerns. So this is one question. The second one is basically about what you mentioned on reaching consensus. I think it's always politically right to mention that. But in some transformational projects, one could really be thinking at a national level in the cases of China 1978, 1979, or in Singapore, for instance. What kind of consensus was there with enlightened leaders like Deng Xiaoping or Lee Kuan Yew had. Of course, you have always the danger that most of the leaders we know of, they consider themselves enlightened already, and some of them, they may end up, the majority I would say, get you in trouble. But basically about this political economic question about reaching consensus, and you won't do anything, and you could be in a paralysis. You could really see a good idea like Bolsa Familia working in Brazil or Mexico, but you cannot transform it because you are not reaching consensus. There are many losers who identify themselves, they will be them against you, despite the inefficiencies. So what did we learn of getting matters right at the beginning until you reach the happy moment of getting the consensus? So those are two simple questions to the team. And Klaus can always, he's the master of answering the simple questions. So
okay, so I'm going to take your bait. I think as far as local institution is concerned and reaching political consensus, those are two tough issues. And let me sort of circle back to doing business, because in some way I've seen doing business when it was started, when it was evaluated, when it was politically discussed at the board. And now I see that it's a transformational engagement. So I've certainly seen this sort of 360-degree experience. I think what we are seeing now in a number of countries, just yesterday we launched the Sept National doing business in Kenya. Huge demand to see this at the county level, at the province level. We see the same thing as Turkey. And I think they're not doing this because they're looking at sort of rising in the ranks. I think that there's a real serious and earnest discussion around creating conditions for private investment. And I think that is a big driving force. And it takes enlightened leaders to see this. I just was in East Africa, and I have to say that that corner of the world was not necessarily particularly enlightened when it came down to doing business. So what is suddenly changing if both in Ethiopia and Kenya this has become sort of a preeminent preoccupation? Again, I would challenge that what has changed is not that doing business has now a better methodology. What has changed is the name of the game is now create conditions for attracting the private sector. And for that, that is a very important indicators. And I think what we are doing also around logistics performance index, women business law, there's now a real consensus in terms of if you really want to create a hospital environment for investors, you really have to understand that those are exactly the type of decision parameters that the private investor is looking for, both domestic as well as foreign. So in that sense, I see that as one of the big transformational changes. If I can offer one more, because this is supposed to be a forward-looking exercise also, I would say one other area where I see a change in tone and a change in enlightenment on the part of people that have steadfastly held on to privileges. It has to do with the whole power of competition in markets. And we have just launched a couple of weeks ago a really interesting report around competition in Africa, making the connection between introducing this and poverty, showing very clearly of what the costs are, pointing very specifically to political interests that are standing in the way. And the surprising part is that that is not something that looks or comes across as Washington Consensus 3.0. It comes across as this is what Kenya wants to do now going forward. And I see that as a real game changer. If we find more support behind this, and that ties into political economy analysis, that ties into opening markets in ways which we haven't done before, to me, that is a real positive example. And the evidence, I see David, of course, in the audience, what we need is we need much better information on this one, because in some way, and that ties back to the question about M&E information, we are probably not collecting enough system-wide information. We are creating project-specific information, and if you want to change a system, chances are what you're actually most in need of is something that shows you how the system overall responds, and you need to do that iteratively.
Right. From the report team, do you have any quick reactions to the local?
Brief intervention.
Yeah, a very brief one, because we have Caroline.
Just very briefly on the issue of the municipal level. So we actually looked at a very broad segment of both national, global, and also local interventions. So we did find some of those interventions, for instance, in bus rapid transit in Colombia, which we classified as transformational. But even going beyond that, there was a lot of the big role of the mayors in those countries, Colombia and so on, to help the country overcome these issues of violence and conflict and address some of those drivers. So I think in that respect, I don't know if that answers your questions, but yes, we see transformations and we see the municipal level and mayors in particular as important drivers. Right. I think I'll leave it at that, and we'll leave it for some more questions.
Thank you so much. We have 2 questions from Polev.com. Mike, why don't you read your own good handwriting here? Mike is my advisor. We communicate all the day by emails and type messages. So we have one on Poland and one for Alan Gelb, and I think one is related to the leadership of Walesa at his time, and the Western economists helped Poland for the transformation from plant to market. So why the World Bank Group define Poland as one of its own transformational cases? Yeah, this one.
I think that's perfect.
All right, okay. The other one is more difficult. I need to change my glasses soon. So
would you like me to read the other one?
Yeah, the one to Alan. Yeah, how does someone?
Is this microphone on? Yes.
Yeah.
The second question is, how does someone act courageously to counter powerful political forces that, as Alan Gelb puts forward, are often the force behind binding constraints?
Right. Okay. So 2 questions here. Why? I think one for the team. Why we claim Poland as one of our own? So I think a quick reminder of what we did right there could be useful. And then we ask Alan, and then we'll give the last word to Caroline, unless there are any kind of questions or comments from the audience.
Yeah. Thanks, Mahmoud.
Or the panel. Okay, go ahead.
Great, thank you. I think I referred to that in my remarks. So we're not claiming Poland as having been transformed by the World Bank Group, but we're claiming Poland as a good example of a country that has transformed itself with the help of the Bank Group, some key analytical work, some key support during the early days of transformation, when the Bank Group helped the country, overcome some of those effects of the initial privatization and the slump that followed. So we're not claiming that the bank has caused this, but the bank was a partner. It helped strengthen institutions. It helped through seminal analytical work. And so we're showcasing it as a country that has been successful, and we're trying to isolate, what have been certain contributions of the World Bank that may have made a catalytic effect at the begining. And also just to reiterate the importance indeed of institutions and of policies. I think I didn't answer the question earlier about political economy considerations, which we did find as being very central in addressing. So it was very important, for instance, in the case of the long-term sector reform in Kenya, to bring all the particular players on board, to have a long-term sort of program to engage with them, to build a constituency for change. And I think this was exactly the difference with Pakistan that didn't happen there. Thank you very much.
So let me ask Alan to react to the question targeted to him, and then I'll ask Klaus, Nena, and I'll give Jörg the final word if they have last seconds kind of intervention before we give the floor to Ms. Hayden.
Okay, just a couple of observations just from what I know. I'm sure others have views on this too. I mean, I don't think that the right word is confront. I don't think the word is to confront powerful political forces. Normally, these forces are there for very powerful reasons, and they're not really going to be very susceptible to small amounts of money going into these countries. So, if you think that you can buy reform with a few million or a few hundred million or maybe even more than that, you're not going to do it. Right? The real question is, how does one try and think of a path which provides an accommodation which is also in the interests of those who are on the other side of the table? And I think, from the bank's point of view, the bank's money is possibly less important in this than the ability of the bank to bring people around a table and to provide information. I'll give you a couple of examples. I was involved in the very early stage of the relationship with China. And one of the big debates that was going on at the time was the rise of the non-state sector. There was strong resistance to this from the state enterprise sector, which in the 1980s was extremely powerful. And the state enterprise sector had some very good examples as to why the non-state sector was a parasitic, bad sector. They were stealing their expertise. They were hiring the engineers away to advise them, giving them meals. They may have even been, appropriating some of the working capital of the state enterprises. They were doing all these things, right? So this was a parasitic sector, and it should have been shut down. And this was a very powerful movement in China at the time. It was the beginning of the private sector. So the bank was involved in an exercise with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. It was the most interesting work I can remember doing in the bank, traveling for a couple of months at a time through these rural areas, doing a lot of in-depth analysis on these firms, surveys. And almost all of the participants were Chinese. They'd never done anything like this, you know. The socialist philosophy doesn't really represent individuals. It talks about classes. They're not great on questions like individual initiative and that sort of stuff in their research methodology, which we tend to adopt as natural. So the result of that was a book called Chinese Rural Industry, which was discussed quite widely in China. And it made the point that actually this was a very productive sector that was emerging in all sorts of ways. And I think it was important in, if you like, bringing at least some in China around to the point that actually this was not a parasitic sector. This was a very logical way of the beginning of a competitive economy. That's one example. The other is, you know, the bank, I think countries do learn from each other, and the bank has a very powerful role there. This is where the doing business type activities come in. I have mixed feelings about doing business, actually. But I think it is very good for getting attention and very good for giving, in other words, creating a conversation about certain things that a country needs. And finally, where I think the bank can do better sometimes is trying to link its analytic work to examples, you know. For example, asking a country, why does electricity cost 5 times more in your country than it does in the country next door? Let's break that down, but let's go further than a report. Let's go into a news report. Let's go into something in the newspapers, on the radio, and so on. So the bank, I think, has all those kind of roles, and I sort of feel that that's more useful to the bank. I mean, the bank is a cooperative of countries. It is not there to confront. It doesn't help to confront its members in a frontal way.
Thank you. So, in 30 seconds, Klaus.
We are not the innovators. We're not the innovators in chief. So that means a lot of what we do is incremental. A lot of this has to be adaptive. And the one thing that we have that nobody else has is we have the longest lasting relations with governments. And I think now that the context is changing, I think we need to make sure that we open their eyes and our own ears to what is actually now the new context, which is very much private sector oriented. I think that is where the biggest change is coming from in terms of our own internal incentives and the way we operate.
For me, I just want to share our commitment, to work on this behavioral change, to work on creating markets, but in collaboration with the bank, because IFC or private sector cannot do it alone. And also to say that in the case of the private sector, it doesn't necessarily need to mean very long-term interventions, but it means actually more programmatic interventions, and we are already breaking grounds in some countries or regions, like scaling solar or capital markets interventions. So just to give you an example of what we are working on now.
I take away the incremental dimension, and was Alan Gelb's mentioned in terms also of accompanying project. I mean, I really think that the monitoring side, which is not the evaluation side, the monitoring side is critical. And how you build that in the decision, for instance, of the board is an interesting question. Again, I come back to the idea, I think probably you cannot start. You can start with the ambition to be transformational, but you also discover opportunity to become transformational while you implement. And that's incremental part, the patience, the time seems to be of the essence, and we need instrument to support that at the management board level, I think.
Right, very good. If the pyramids were not good enough to get you convinced of the Egyptian miracles. Now we finished before 4, and I'm giving the floor back to the efficient German machine to see how it works.
Oh dear, oh dear. Well, let me close this session with thanking everybody, obviously the team that has worked for me and the panelists who've been discussing our work here so well informed and so interestingly. It's been a real pleasure to listen to all of you, and thank you, Mahmoud, for chairing the session so well. This was a venture we started on that we knew was going to be complicated and that was not going to be easy. I'm very pleased to hear that this sort of first array into dealing with transformational engagement has sort of like triggered this kind of conversation, because that is what we were hoping for. We were not setting out and saying like we will find all the ultimate answers to transformation, because as Jörg was just saying, this is transformation. This is iterative, both the transformational process, but developing the understanding of what is transformational and how it works. There were a number of comments and points the panelists made that reiterated things that the study have highlighted. What are some of the key ingredients that are needed? And I think everybody made a very strong point about the importance of leadership, that one can't take it for granted, that one can't confront it, but that one has to work with it over time to ensure that there is a sort of continuous engagement and bringing institutions on board and aligning various stakeholders around a transformational agenda. This transformational agenda, while requiring on one hand a vision, is not always obvious from the outset. And so having that ability to see beyond the sort of like first round of change and understand what will come beyond the next round and the next round, and that this will take time and have the patience for that, was a very important insight that I can relate to, having worked for about 30 years in development. You know, this is really how development happens and how transformational change can take place. But in addition to all these ingredients that we know we need, we also spoke about a lot of things that stand in the way, not the binding constraints to transformational change, but even to pursuing it. So whether it is the constraints and the drivers of the board of wanting to see short-term success, not having the the long-term staying power, even though the shareholders stay, but it is the representatives who change, and people are impatient to see that money leads to results. Or the internal pressures, the incentives of how do I look at what my result is, how do I understand whether I have done a great job or not, which when we talk about a transformational engagement that takes much, much longer, how do you incentivize the right behaviors that go beyond approving alone and getting on with that? What obviously from an evaluation point of view I thought was extremely powerful to hear is the need for data, the need for monitoring, the need for continuous evaluation, self-evaluation, course corrections, understanding how we can learn from the situation as it is and how it needs to be adapted, and whether this is a dead end, or whether, yes, this is a failure, but going beyond that will eventually lead to better results. Making it a very deliberative, iterative process that has that long-term vision and stays with it is really a very powerful message. In terms of the points that were raised towards the end, getting countries to have systems by which they themselves can now monitor and evaluate whether they're making progress is extremely important. And having been in evaluation for 30 years, I can assure you that countries are ready. Countries are demanding this. I've just come back from a conference in China where we talked about building capacities in countries so that they can actually take charge of their development process processes in progress, which they should, and therefore they should become better informed partners to work with the World Bank Group and other stakeholders for better transformational change. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel again.